Hello, long time no speak. Hope you're all well and surviving riots and COVID-19 and all the other shite that's going on in the world right now. This is going to be a quick review of something I said I'd reviewed donkeys ago, which is the Eachine UZ65, which is a 65mm tiny whoop. And I say ages ago because this thing has taken a world record amount of time to arrive. I think it took 6 weeks, whereas usually using priority direct shipping to the UK, it would have normally taken 7 to 10 days. So it looks like this got stuck in the really bad patch that we went through with Banggood. And funnily, I've ordered quite a bit of stuff, GPS modules and bits and bobs, and they've all arrived in the usual 7 to 10 days. So fingers crossed we're over that horrific no man's land of shipping. But if you do order anything from them, just make sure that you check the processing time, because a lot of stuff saying processing 22 days, which of course you want to avoid like the plague. But if it says it's going to ship in 24 hours or 1 to 2 days, you should be good from what I can gather. But waffle out of the way, as normal. Little tiny whoop comes with a spare bag of props, a prop removal tool, some spare screws and a little USB charger. Comes with 4 Eachine branded 300 milliamp hour high voltage LiPos, of which the other 3 are on charge. And this little guy comes in a number of different configurations, but this is the one that comes with Crossfire. And to be honest, the only reason why I requested it with Crossfire is if it's a lot of rubbish, I have a Crossfire receiver, which is always nice to have. Generally speaking, I would say that these guys are best with an SPI receiver, because you're not really going to be doing long range or going particularly a long way. But if you're one of the specialist users who might be interested, obviously this guy can run Crossfire. Also comes in the usual FreeSky, FlySky versions as well. And the one major competitor to this guy in my eyes is the Mobula 65, of which I have 2 of them, because I liked it so much that I got one for my son as well. And generally speaking, I don't like tiny whoops. Historically, I've found them to fly really bad. And they're sort of like a toy that you use for 5 minutes and then forget about and never use again. But because we've been in this lockdown situation, I was flying this guy a ton because I couldn't get out to fly anything else. So as I'm stuck working from home from now, if the system went down, this guy, I'd be flying out my windows, and they fly great out the box without any faff whatsoever. Set the camera angle to 10 degrees, flash it to update the BL Heli 32 firmware to 48K with Jazz Maverick, etc. And you've got a fantastic little whoop, and these are both the 25K versions, so they go like the clappers. So as these two are pretty evenly matched in terms of price, by the Crossfire version, which is obviously 25-30 quid more expensive. The major difference between them is the size of the props, and Eachine have done a sort of unusual, or they've tried to think out of the box and put bigger props on the same size quad. So if you look at them side by side, the Eachine is ever so slightly narrower motor to motor than the Mobula 65, and they're about the same. Actually, the Eachine's actually smaller footprint, even though it's got bigger props. And I suppose what Eachine are trying to do here is, if we get this little quad and these particular ones are running the same size 0.8 or 2 motors, but the Eachine one is running, what are they, 19,000 kV, which you can get on this guy as well. I suppose the idea is if you get a quad and you keep the weight pretty low but get bigger props on it, it should perform better. However, there's a big if there, and that's only if the motors are good for spinning those additional props. If we look at weight, the Mobula is super light. Obviously it's got an SPI built-in receiver, and it comes in at, get it on the scales properly, comes in at 20.4 grams. This guy, the UZ65, again with its crossfire receiver, comes in at 23.3 grams. So it's essentially 3 grams heavier. 1.5 to 2 grams of that will be the TBS crossfire nano. And because the antenna came sort of floating out the back 6 miles, I've just clumsily zip tied it to the back of the quad because I don't need great range on this. So the proof in the pudding is going to be how these guys will fly. I'll quickly show you how this came set up in Betaflight and just a couple of changes that I've done to it, and then we'll go on to the flight footage. The only thing that I would say is spec wise, by the KV of the motors, these two guys are very similar. They're both running the Runcam 3, they've both got F4 all-in-one flight controllers. The obvious difference is that this is the original Runcam 3 with its round lens, and I believe this is the newer version with it kind of has like a square section around the lens. And I've heard that the new lens is absolutely awful, and the lens manufacturer for the original Runcam Nano went out of stock, so it'll be interesting to see how the camera is, because I wasn't a particular fan of the Runcam 3. In sunny conditions, it has a habit of sort of making everything highlighted sort of pink, and when the sun dips it becomes really pixelated. So if this guy is worse with its different lens on, we might have an issue. The only other thing I would touch on is that the VTX in this little guy, when it came out of the box, was sort of hitting the back of the camera, and the camera was set to sort of a ridiculous, well for me, ridiculous sort of 55-degree angle. So I've just had to sort of wiggle the VTX around to get the camera down to the sort of 25 degrees or so that I prefer. Right, so I'll just quickly walk you through the Betaflight setup, and then we'll talk about the flight. So as you can see, everything is pretty standard, and in fairness to Eachine, everything is set up pretty well. The only major changes I've done are eventually I'll increase the idle speed to 9. I've turned off motor stop because I want my props to spin when I'm armed. And the interesting thing about this little guy is it comes pre-set up with RPM filters. So it's running BL Heli S16.8, and they've obviously used Jazz Maverick etc's firmware to get RPM filters working. This little guy, as I said, doesn't have RPM filters working, but it just runs the 48K. The downside of the Mobula in its 25K version is you'll struggle to get more than sort of 2.5 to 3 minutes of flight time. It's pretty greedy on its battery because of its great performance. So again, it'd be interesting to see what this guy does. In terms of things I'm doing, all I've basically done is added in the FPV camera angle of a 10, which will mix roll and yaw and help us turn a little bit easier. And in terms of rates don't have any impact on angle mode except yaw, so I've just increased yaw as you tend to use a lot of yaw on these guys and use that to turn around. Everything else was set up fine. Crossfire was set up fine. The OSD has been set up, so it was just a case of adding in my modes. So if we come to the flight, I'm not going to beat around the bush here. It performs worse by a fair margin than the Mobula 65, and I think the reason why it performs worse, even though it flies very nicely, it's very smooth, as is the Mobula. I think the reason why it performs worse and the way it feels is it's just not as responsive. And I think that comes down to the larger props. The motors, the 0.8 or 2 motors, which are the same size on the Mobula and the UZ65, they just don't have enough grunt to get those props up to speed as quickly as they can on the Mobula 65. And what that means is you sort of feel like when you back off and then hit the throttle again, there's a little bit more delay, and you find yourself sort of struggling a little bit more to keep the quad low or keep it at a level playing field, because after you've flown the Mobula, it's a lot more responsive. The Mobula can be flown much quicker, and that leads me on to the glaring obvious issue, which you can see from the DVR. The camera on the UZ65 is absolutely shocking. In this sort of relatively, what time is it, 7 o'clock at night, 6:30 at night, so the sun is going down, but there's still plenty of light. I could barely see where I was going. There was that much sort of pixelization. And okay, I've been flying mostly DJI FPV quads recently, but this thing is atrocious. And given they're both Runcam 3s, it's down to the difference in this new lens, which is frankly rubbish. So I'm guessing there are much better cameras out there than the Runcam 3 now, unless they can sort this issue out. I mean, if you look at them side by side, the Mobula, which I've never thought was a particularly great camera, is night and day better than the UZ65. So yeah, I'm not really going to sort of beat around the bush. If you want a little quad, unless you need to run Crossfire, I'd avoid the UZ65. It's a fine little quad. It's smooth, it's quiet, it flies perfectly nicely, but it's just not as fun or as responsive as the Mobula 65. And even if you're a brand new pilot, it doesn't mean that it's easier to fly, because it's not, because that lack of responsiveness means that you end up sort of overcorrecting. It's a little bit more sluggish to turn in. Everything about it is just a little bit more difficult to control, whereas the Mobula is alive. It really does fly like a much bigger quad, and it goes where you want it to go. So it remains, for me, in terms of its price range, the absolute one to beat. I know Beta FPV do the Meteor 65, which you can get with Crossfire and some others, and I'm sure they're great as well, but none of them are, the 60 odd quid that the Mobula is. And my two have taken a hell of a bashing, and still work, as good today as they did when we got them. Both of these are made by Happy Model. The Eachine is just a branding stuck on stuff that bang goodbye. It's clearly Happy Model, same motors, different KV, but one is infinitely worse than the other one. So it's a great little quad, unless you've flown the Mobula 65, which trounces it in every single way. So that is that. In terms of other things, if you saw my community post, you know that I have built a Betaflight quad, which is the Project 399 you see here. And if you're familiar with this channel, you know that that's quite unusual, because I've hated Betaflight since the release of 4. And I've kind of kept in touch with its progress, but I've never liked it. It was far too much messing around for me, and the end result was always a lack of consistency in varying conditions. However, I flashed Betaflight 4.2 on this just to see what it was like. My initial impressions are really favourable. In terms of what I did, I just flashed the stock settings, moved the slider, filter slider slightly to the right, I think a couple of clicks, and reduced eye gain by roughly half, because I hate the stiff way that Betaflight flies. And the quad flew really smooth, really smooth. The only thing that it was struggling with, and it was a really odd situation, is when I did fast pitch flips. Got this sort of weird sort of kick out at the end of the move, so I'll need to see what that was. It may be because my Cadex Vista was a little bit loose and maybe that was causing some vibration, so I need to find that out. But I was going to do a video on Betaflight 4.2, but having thought about it, I'm not going to bother, because whatever I say, somebody's going to sort of come back and say, you should have done this. If you put into the CLI the number 696, divide it by your dog's birthday and add on your granny's favourite number, it will fly perfectly, because essentially that's where Betaflight is right now. It's got more bells and whistles than you can shake a stick at. So I'm quite quietly going to tinker with it a little bit in terms of its basic features, see if I can get this guy flying anywhere close to my KISS quads. And the reason why I built this guy, the Project 399 frame, is it's a cracking sort of strong frame, 6mm arms, and I wanted something that would take a bit of a bashing that I wouldn't I wouldn't be worried about breaking. As although my Halo RC frames have been absolutely great, I wouldn't want to put them against a concrete wall or a bando and really fly hard, whereas this guy is really, really chunky. So anyway, that's enough for me. End of the waffle. Happy flying. As I said, I hope everybody's keeping well. I've got some stuff that I'm tinkering around with that may or may not appear on my channel if I can be bothered doing another video. I've got an FR7 which I'm tinkering with. I have the little what is it, Dragon Frog I think it's called, a little Banggood 3-inch frame, which is a corking little frame actually, and pretty nicely designed. And the idea of this guy is you would run a toothpick style flight controller and the Cadex Vista in the back. The downside of it is it's advertised at 30 grams, which I thought would be great with a set of 1105 or 1106 motors on, but it's actually 37 grams in the flesh when you add the screws to it, which might make it a little bit porky. But the idea of this for me was, rather than flying the toothpicks with the Vista stuck on top of that small X design in a really isolated and fragile manner, I thought it might be a useful thing. That's a sort of Cadex Vista mount from the Halo RC toothpick that I was using, but in a bad crash this sort of makes it feel a little bit exposed. So I thought the Dragon Frog, I think it's called, would be a good option, but I'm not so sure now at that sort of weight. So yeah, that's it from me. Ended the video on the usual waffle. Happy flying. Cheers guys. Thanks. Bye bye.